authored by our rules colleague, Mr. Massey, which terminates the CDC's requirement that all foreign travelers flying to the United States be vaccinated against COVID-19. While courts have made clear that a vaccine mandate cannot be imposed on a national level, that has not stopped the Biden administration from attempting to impose one whenever and wherever they choose. Most other nations in the world, including Canada, Mexico, and every country in the European Union, have abandoned a vaccine mandate for foreign travelers. It's time that the United States join them and abandon this illogical mandate. Our other two items, H.R. Res. 24 and H.J. Res. 26, are both joint resolutions of disapproval of laws passed by the District of Columbia Council. Under the District of Columbia Home Rule Act, laws passed by the D.C. Council are subject to congressional review and will not take effect if Congress passes into law a joint resolution of disapproval. Congress exercising this power is both necessary and appropriate in both these circumstances. H.J. Res. 24 would disapprove of D.C.'s plan to allow non-citizens, including illegal immigrants, to vote in local elections. Allowing non-citizens to vote dilutes the power of U.S. citizens at the ballot box and injects foreign influence into the most critical issues facing American families. H.J. Res. 26 would disapprove of the reduction in criminal penalties for violent crimes committed inside the District of Columbia and would make it substantially easier for violent offenders to reduce their sentences. Indeed, this bill was so bad that Mayor Muriel Bowser actually vetoed it, only for the District of Columbia Council to override her veto. So we're actually on the side of the mayor and the Washington Post, which editorialized against that particular matter. We're seeing elevated crime rates across America in general, and then the District of Columbia in particular, and would be unconscionable to adopt policies that will put violent criminals back on the streets. I now yield to my good friend, our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. You know, I was home over the weekend, like I expect most of you were, and had a lot of official events and unofficial events. Spent time, you know, food shopping in my local supermarket, and I heard a lot from a lot of constituents about a lot of things. You know what I didn't hear about? Any of the stuff we're doing today, or quite frankly, any of the stuff we've done up to this point. The stuff that's on people's minds doesn't seem to be the priorities of this new Republican majority. I mean, we're dealing with a bunch of bills today. You mentioned that, Mr. Chairman, another bill, anti-vaccination bill, and then two issues that are basically really internal issues in the D.C. City Council. You know, I don't know about what happens in your district, but I can tell you in Worcester, Massachusetts, people aren't talking about what happens in the D.C. City Council. They care about crime, but they're not focused on overturning or reaffirming or doing anything that involves the D.C. City Council. They want things that are going to make a difference in our community, and I suspect that that's the case of people all over this country. I will tell you what I did hear. People are concerned about what Republicans have in mind when it comes to cutting programs in exchange for not defaulting on our debt. People are concerned about legislation that's been introduced by Republicans to basically overturn the cap on the cost of insulin for people on Medicare. It's hard to believe that there are actually people here who want to undo that. Those are the things that my constituents care about. So it's great to see you. Everybody looks fabulous and all rested for the wonderful weekend. But, you know, we're going to do this week, and then we're going to break for 2 weeks. And, you know, in the first almost 2 months of this session, this is all we're going to have done. Again, stuff that people, by and large, are not thinking about. I'll just point out one last thing. There's a new poll that shows that 73% of Americans, Democrats, independents, and nearly half of all Republicans say the GOP majority is not focusing on the right issues. You know what? The American people are smart. They see right through all of this, and they want to see real action. They want us to get stuff done, but stuff that has meaning in their lives. not this kind of stuff. But anyway, I yield back.
Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in the record. I'd like to welcome our first panel, Chairman Comer and Ranking Member Raskin. Always good to see both of you up here. And welcome to the witness table. Chairman Comer, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McGovern. I urge the Rules Committee to grant a prompt rule for the House's consideration of two bills, each of which strikes down a law adopted by the D.C. Council. One of the bills is my House Joint Resolution 24, disapproving of the District of Columbia's Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022. The other bill is Representative Clyde's House Joint Resolution 26, disapproving of D.C.'s Revised Criminal Code Act of 2022. Our nation's capital city is in crisis. Crime is rampant. Students in D.C. public schools suffered historic learning loss because Democrats kept schools closed. Buildings are sitting empty while federal workers continue to work from home. We talked about that last week. But the D.C. Council has chosen to prioritize legislation that will make things worse. This includes a bill, the Local Resident Voting Rights Act Amendment of 2022, to allow non-citizens, including illegal immigrants and foreign employees at embassies openly hostile to the United States, to vote in local elections. This move by the D.C. Council dilutes the votes of American citizens, including the many residents of the district who struggled and sacrificed to obtain legal citizenship. Voting is a pillar of American democracy and a constitutional right that must be protected and preserved for citizens of our country. Voting is how Americans exert their will upon the government. Voting ultimately determines how laws are written and enforced so that citizens can shape the rules under which they can earn a living and be protected from harm. Voting is an essential privilege and responsibility established at great cost throughout our nation's history. Yet on November 21st, 2022, the D.C. Council chose to grant the vote to anyone residing in the district, including those here illegally and other non-citizens. Now just think about the immediate implications of this law. Our nation's capital city plays host to hundreds of foreign organizations and embassies. Many of these foreign nationals have interests directly opposed to those of the United States. They make no claim otherwise. D.C.'s laws make zero exceptions for such individuals whose role may be to disrupt or destroy the American way of life and principles our nation stands upon. For years, my Democrat colleagues have decried potential foreign influence in our electoral process. But D.C.'s new law potentially allows foreign agents from China, Russia, and other adversaries to participate in local elections held within this nation's capital city. This law is so bad, the D.C. Council even lost the support of the Washington Post editorial board. In October of last year, the Post estimated 50,000 non-citizen D.C. residents would be able to vote under this act, which it viewed as a bridge too far. I think most of us can agree with that. I think most of the American people would agree with that. Even D.C. Mayor Bowser agrees with us and chose to withhold her own signature from this legislation. While the bill was ultimately enacted without her support, it is shocking that even the progressive Democrat mayor of D.C. does not support the actions of the out-of-control D.C. Council. Our free and fair elections are the hallmark of a healthy democracy, and we must protect them. The D.C. Council's law intends to do the opposite. For these reasons, I urge you to support my resolution of disapproval to stop this radical reform in its tracks. Secondly, and as if this was not bad enough, the radical D.C. Council has also enacted legislation that will turn this crime crisis into a catastrophe by passing the Revised Criminal Code Act of 2022. Let's be clear. The capital city, America's city, is in a crisis. According to the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, carjackings in the district have increased by 76% compared to this time last year. Total property crime is up 24%. Homicides are up 17%. In fact, D.C. is currently on track to have the most homicides since 1995. But the radical D.C. Council has enacted legislation that will turn this crime crisis into a catastrophe. The D.C. Council's progressive soft-on-crime legislation eliminates almost all the mandatory minimum sentencing requirements for violent crimes, and it drastically reduces the maximum penalties allowable to the courts. These changes further embolden criminals to run rampant throughout the District of Columbia. The act also grants a right to jury trial for most misdemeanor offenses. The D.C. court system is already overloaded. This change will burden the D.C. court system even more, reducing the resources devoted to hearing cases for serious felony offenses. The D.C. Council's legislation is eroding an individual's right to a fair and speedy trial granted to them through our Constitution. All Americans should feel safe in their capital city, but they don't because of D.C. Democrats' leniency towards criminals at the expense of American safety. Ensuring public safety and addressing crime is a cornerstone of the House Republicans' policy agenda. In November last year, Americans voted for a new majority in the House, a new majority that will address crime head-on to ensure a nation that's safe. This D.C. Council legislation is a brazen rejection of law and order, ignoring the high rates of criminality in the district and doubling down on leniency for society's violent criminals is a dereliction of duty. If the D.C. Council wants to continue to skirt its responsibility to the people, they will have to answer to this Congress. It should be noted that we in Congress are not alone. The D.C. Police Union, representing 3,500 members, and the National Fraternal Order of Police are strongly in favor of House Joint Resolution 26, stating in a recent letter to Congress that the D.C. Act will, quote, will embolden criminals, dramatically increase crime and violence, and render police officers in the District of Columbia virtually powerless to adequately police the city and keep its residents and visitors safe. Additionally, on January 4th, D.C. Mayor Bowser took the extraordinary step of vetoing this legislation, calling the proposals, quote, controversial, and stating the act, quote, does not make the district safer. Mayor Bowser's bold executive veto sent a strong message that the policy proposals of this bill are simply unworkable and unsafe for the district. There may not be much Mayor Bowser and I have agreed on in the past, but today we are on the same page. I call on all of my colleagues to join me in supporting Mr. Clyde's resolution of disapproving the D.C. Revised Criminal Code Act of 2022. We must ensure these terrible criminal code reforms are not put into place. Again, I ask the Rules Committee to grant a prompt rule for the House's consideration of these resolutions, and I welcome the committee's questions. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Raskin, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you, and Mr. McGovern, it's good to see you. I've come to oppose these two resolutions, which we've had no hearings on, that seek to overturn and nullify laws duly enacted by the representatives of the 713,000 citizens who live in Washington, D.C. You know, the framers of our Constitution observed that Newton's third law of motion acts in politics as well as in physics. Every action creates an equal and opposite reaction, and the people of Washington dared to upset the apple cart in the last two Congresses by challenging their political disenfranchisement, their complete lockout from voting representation in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, and all of the political discrimination that is routinely waged against them. The only community of tax-paying, draftable U.S. citizens who have no voting representation in the Congress of the United States. And now today, they're starting to pay the price, at least if the majority gets its way. Now, Washingtonians have a real and old-fashioned political grievance, the kind of grievance that the framers of our Constitution understood well: disenfranchisement, taxation without representation. And this is a real grievance, not an imaginary one, like a fictionalized stolen election, and they chose to act to redress their grievance. After more than 2 centuries of having no voting voice in Congress and having their laws subject to interference by other people's representatives, after more than 2 centuries of taxation, military service, and conscription without representation in the body that decides on war and everything else at the federal level, the people of Washington simply had enough. And it's true that not everyone noticed because they acted nonviolently. Even though they live right nearby, they didn't come and storm the Capitol and beat the daylights out of 150 Capitol police officers, breaking their arms and legs and ribs and jaws and noses, leaving many of them permanently injured and disfigured and traumatized. They didn't try to overthrow the government. They didn't threaten our lives, and they didn't get anyone killed. Indeed, on January 6, 2021, hundreds of Washingtonians serving as Metropolitan Police Department officers or Capitol Police officers and many others defended the Capitol with their bodies and their lives, while out-of-state insurrectionists and coup plotters and cop haters descended on the Capitol to attack us. Washingtonians acted to save the very Congress in which they still have no voting representation at all. You talk about patriotism, that's patriotism. But if they didn't try to violently overthrow the government and install a dictator, what did they do that's gotten everyone in the majority so upset with them that they want to overturn their local laws for the first time in more than 3 decades? Well, it's simple. They exercised their rights under the First Amendment, the Ninth Amendment, and the 10th Amendment by speaking, assembling, organizing a statehood constitutional convention, and then submitting a petition for redress of grievances and for admission as a state to the Union. They did what 37 states have done successfully before them. They tried to get Congress to use our powers under Article 4 to end their second-class status and disenfranchisement by admitting them on an equal footing with the original 13 states. And this is apparently what has set the majority off. In the last 2 Congresses, in 2020 and 2021, the House voted to approve Washington's petition for admission to the Union as a state, bringing Washington that much closer to the plane of equality in the Union. D.C. statehood did not make it through the Senate in either case, but that provisional defeat for the people of Washington is apparently not enough for the new majority, which shrewdly understands that most statehood drives take many years and that D.C. statehood is picking up a lot of momentum. So the new majority has been constructed with votes of a lot of MAGA members, like Representative Green, who told us in the Oversight Committee the other day that the major civil rights issue she sees in Washington today is the discriminatory mistreatment, not of Washingtonians, but of MAGA insurrectionists who are in jail for assaulting officers, interfering with a federal proceeding, and engaging in seditious conspiracy, which means conspiring to overthrow the government of the United States. The people of Washington are now apparently being forced to pay the price for stepping out of line and simply demanding equal rights. The majority wants to teach them a lesson for talking about statehood and opposing insurrection. And they want to turn the clock back on D.C.'s home rule power and relive the glory days when Washington was run like a colony by some racist Dixiecrats out of the House District Committee. Yes, that was my party in power then, and it was wrong then, and it's wrong now. Today, it's the GOP that's determined to put the people of Washington in their place. And make no mistake, it's not just these 2 laws that showed up today without any hearing at all, without any analysis by the committee. They will be attacking Washington not just for its local voting rights policies and criminal justice code, but for its gun safety policies, its defense of abortion rights and LGBTQ rights, its decriminalization of marijuana, and dozens of other issues potentially headed to the House floor if we really want to go down this road of becoming the super DC City Council. My friend Chairman Comer mentioned carjacking and complains of the DC Council's revision of the local criminal justice code. But if we're going to get into the details, let's see how that works. Well, armed carjacking in Washington, D.C., under the legislation we would be repealing today, would get you a sentence of up to 24 years. In Arizona, the most you could get would be 10 years. In Georgia, the most you could get would be 20 years. In Kansas, which has no carjacking statute, you could get 20 years, 20.5 years for armed robbery. In Kentucky, there's no carjacking statute at all, but first-degree armed robbery, which would get you a max of 20 years, 4 years less than you could get in the District of Columbia under the offense that the chairman just cited. Do we really want to sit as a super state legislature micromanaging the laws of this jurisdiction? It just makes no sense to enter into a policy analysis of the district's particular laws any more than it would make sense for us to do that to Kentucky or Massachusetts or Oklahoma. Is this really how we want to be spending our time? In 2016, 86% of residents of this city voted for statehood, and wherever these people stand on particular policy issues, I can assure you that by an overwhelming margin, they want Congress to stop trying to control them and micromanage their affairs. And I believe, although the mayor does indeed side with you on the substance of the particular laws, she has said she does not believe Congress should intervene to overthrow the local will of the people of Washington, D.C., as expressed through their local government. The D.C. population is larger than that of 2 states. It pays more federal taxes per capita than the people of any state, and they pay more in hard dollars than the people of 23 states. And you might look to see exactly where your state fits on that. The D.C. has a gross domestic product larger than the GDP of 17 states. Its bond rating is higher than that of 32 states. So the majority today seeks to use an arcane procedure that's only been used 3 times since D.C. got home rule back in 1973. The last of these resolutions was over 3 decades ago when Congress disapproved a D.C. law related to building height restrictions. The final point I want to make is that there is a powerful logic to the dynamics of statehood in American history. We were designed as a constitutional republic on democratic principles, and when the Northwest Ordinance was adopted, Thomas Jefferson was very clear that no community of free citizens was to be controlled and lorded over by other people's representatives in the federal government. Everyone would be on the eventual path to statehood, self-government, and political equality and freedom. That's why 37 of 50 states, nearly 75%, came into the Union after the original 13. Despite every manner of objection, opponents said that this state was too big or too small. It was a foreign republic like Texas, or it was formerly part of another state like West Virginia or Vermont or Kentucky or Tennessee and many others. They were too Catholic, they were too Mormon, they were too immigrant, they were too racist, they were too far away, they were not contiguous, they were too poor, they were too rich. In every case, the logic of political equality, freedom, and democratic self-government has prevailed over partisan sniping and griping like that. And I would say, for their patriotism and their contributions to America, we owe the people of Washington, D.C. a lot more than our contempt and derision. We owe them statehood, but they certainly don't deserve more political tyranny and gratuitous insult while they wait for Congress to do the right thing. I hope everyone believes in the democratic principles of our Constitution and will join me in rejecting this radical attempt to interfere with D.C.'s duly enacted laws. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you both for your testimony. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record letters from the D.C. Police Union and the National Fraternal Order of Police expressing support for H.J. Res. 26. Hearing no objection, I now recognize Dr. Burgess for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here today and for your thoughtful testimony. Mr. Comer, let me just ask you, absent these 2 joint resolutions that you're proposing today, when would these 2 statutes go into effect? So there's some urgency to us doing this. Well, I thank you for, I mean, it just, some of this stuff sometimes just defies gravity, letting non-citizens vote. I mean, there'd be no way to explain that back home.
Right.
And to allow that to occur in the nation's capital. And you're right about the crime part. I mean, we and every visitor who comes to the nation's capital, we have that responsibility as well.
Right. If I may, Mr. Burgess, the Biden administration just issued a statement of administration policy that both House Resolution 24 and 26 does not include a veto threat. So it just states that Congress should let D.C. be a state. That's the position from the White House. So they're not threatening to veto this. That's quite a pivot from where they were a week ago. So I think the public support is clearly on our side on these 2 resolutions, and there is a sense of urgency, as you mentioned.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking members recognized for any questions he cares to ask.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first of all, let me thank Chairman Comer for stating that free and fair elections are the hallmark of our democracy. I just wish a majority in your party shared that view, quite frankly, given what we've gone through the last couple of years. Secondly, I want to thank Congressman Raskin, Ranking Member Raskin, for pointing out how lax some of the penalties are in a lot of states all across this country when it comes to violent crimes, when you compare it to what is on the books for D.C. So I don't think this really is about cracking down on crime. I think it's more about messaging. It's more about exerting power over the D.C. government. I don't know if any of you know this. You know what according to U.S. News and World Report, you know what the 4th most dangerous place to live in the United States is? Bakersfield, California. That's Speaker McCarthy's district. I'll also note that the mayor of Bakersfield is a Republican. The homicide rate in Kern County, Speaker McCarthy's home county, is the highest of any California county, according to the Department of Justice. So if we want to talk seriously about combating crime, and by the way, that's an issue that my constituents care about. It's not this. And if Mrs. O'Leary is watching this, I don't think this is on C-SPAN or C-SPAN 2, maybe it's a C-SPAN 25 that this is on right now, but if she's watching, she's probably stressing, what the hell are you people doing? I mean, with all the problems and the challenges we have to deal with, you're focused on trying to overturn something the DC City Council did? Again, it kind of demonstrates how screwed up the priorities are. I mean, people thought we were going to do more to combat inflation. People thought we were going to do more to, deal with a whole range of issues, right? And this is what we're dealing with. So I thank you both for coming, but I have nothing more to say. I'll yield back my time.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for any questions she may have.
So, Mr. Comer, has Congress ever, I should not say we, but has Congress ever invoked that Home Rule Act before? But we do have the ability to do it. Okay, and because Washington DC is an exception to the rule, I mean, it's something different than others. And I think that, before I go too much further, I did want to just respond a little bit to Mr. McGovern discussing what he heard this weekend. And I did hear from people in my district about elections, which we are addressing. I did hear about the Biden administration failing to deal with the Chinese spy balloon that was going across the country, and
Would you lady yield? Just wait.
and I did hear about
DC local elections in Minnesota? That's what
I
they
heard
call it?
about Mr. McGovern. I didn't yield, but yes, I did hear
Wow.
significantly about the elections, and
DC
because our people, yes, our
Oh, my
people are
goodness.
concerned about these
That's
things.
unbelievable.
They hear about, well, believe it, I'm saying it. And I didn't yield. But we did hear about, getting rid of the COVID mandates that we're going to be dealing with later. And so maybe you didn't hear about it in your district, but we are hearing about those things in our district. So I did want to point that out. There are people that are concerned with it. And there's people, I hear about DC statehood in my district. People are paying attention to what's going on in Congress and across the country. But I do think that, this election issue is particularly when we're having non-citizen votes. That does affect the entire country. And, but I just wanted to just touch base on those things, and I think that we do have the ability to do this, and that's why I asked about the Home Rule Act. So, and with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions she has.
Thank you. I had to do a little research this weekend when I saw what was coming up. Hadn't previously had to deal with the Home Rule Act here. Mr. Raskin, you seem to have some familiarity with it. Do you know how many times Congress has disallowed laws that have been duly passed by the District of Columbia?
But I believe 3 times that it's happened, and the last time was relating to building height restrictions, where there's, a significant federal interest. But yeah, the basic premise of the Home Rule Act is the same premise of the Home Rule Act in all of our states, which is to devolve to the localities as much decision-making authority as possible so they can make their own decisions. And so it's a rare thing. I guess states will occasionally override something that a local government does. I'd like to take the opportunity just to say the criminal code revision, which is one of the targets here, doesn't go into effect until 2025 in DC. So if we're going to sit as the super Washington DC City Council, we clearly have enough time to have a real hearing about the particulars of that and compare it to the other states provision by provision to see if we think it's okay or not.
Well, with respect to that criminal code, the research I did indicated that this is something that's been in the works for 5 years, and they've consulted with experts because the last time they passed a criminal code for DC was 1901, so it's way out of date, right?
As I understand it, they're doing what a lot of states have done, which is to move to a model penal code-based criminal justice revision, and those always take many years to do, but they've got, everybody involved, the legislators and the local judges testifying and the lawyers and so on, and this is what they came up with, and it's subject to the democratic process, just like the laws are subject to democratic process in the states where we live.
So we've got 700,000 people who live in DC, and their duly elected representatives passed these two laws, went all the way through the process there, and now Congress is going to come in and say, no, you can't do these two things with respect to local elections, not federal elections, and with respect to your local criminal code.
Yeah, without so much as a hearing. And, but by the way, a number of the states represented by the distinguished members here have had non-citizen voting in their history. More than 40 states, at least 40 states, have had non-citizen voting. And the great champion of non-citizen voting was, of course, Abraham Lincoln. And the original theory of non-citizen voting was what mattered under the wealth and property qualifications and the race and gender qualifications was simply, did you own property? And your citizenship was deemed to be irrelevant. But it became a major bone of contention between the northern states and the southern states before the Civil War, because the seceding states were saying that the immigrant population was anti-slavery, so they wanted to disenfranchise them. And Lincoln stood up for it. And of course, when he won the election in 1860, a lot of them were saying it was on the strength of the immigrant vote, because in those days, non-citizens could vote not just in local, but also state and federal elections. What's happening in D.C. is just their council and their school board elections, which is the practice that survives in a bunch of municipalities around the country.
Including New York City, isn't it?
I think that may have been
Maybe not there.
overturned by the
But a
legislature,
number.
but certainly they voted for it. I don't know what happened to it. Yeah.
So what we're being asked to do here today is very similar to if Montana or North Dakota or any one of our states that has less than 700,000 people in it decided to set up its own election laws, and Congress said, nope, we think better than you. We're going to tell you how you have to run your local elections.
Yeah. I mean, I find that the insult is made all the more profound because the people from Washington, D.C. are being kept from voting for representatives to Congress. And then they're told, yeah, in your school board elections and your advisory neighborhood commission elections, you can't even allow immigrants to vote if that's what you want to do. And why would any of us care about that if that's what they want to do?
So going back to the crimes code that we're being asked to toss out after years of work, so the citizens of DC, through their representatives, have tried to revise their crimes code, presumably to improve the situation regarding crime in DC, and we're being asked to just throw out that effort.
As I understand it, and again, I hesitate to get involved into the particulars, but what they did was they looked to see what judges were actually doing, and then they set maximum sentences at a rate higher than what the average sentences were in their jurisdiction. So obviously, nobody's more interested in getting rid of crime in Washington than the people of Washington and their representatives.
And also, if we pass this resolution, then we're going to say that everything has to stay just as it is, which Chairman Comer indicated is pretty bad. So if we pass this resolution, it's not going to get better. It does nothing to affect crime in DC.
Oh, right. Well, at that point, we're then in a game of, cat and mouse with the DC City Council, and they've got to try to figure out how they can do something that would escape the wrath of Congress. I mean, to me, there's just something deeply undemocratic about dictating to them their local laws.
Okay. Well, I would associate myself with the ranking member's remarks that this does not seem to be serious legislation. It does not seem to be directed at the issues that my constituents are concerned about. Certainly, from what I've heard ever since arriving in Congress, people are loath to interfere in local election rules, and I don't see any way that this helps address crime in our communities. So I don't see why it should go forward. I do think we should be taking up the DC statehood bill because, as we've said, there's 700,000 people who reside in DC, and they deserve to have their voices heard. I'd yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, is recognized for whatever questions he cares to address to the panel.
Thank the chairman. Ranking Member Raskin, you weren't proposing that we go back when you extolled the virtues of allowing people who weren't citizens to vote because they own property. You're not suggesting to go back to those rules, are you?
No, I was just trying to explain the history of it because for most of our history and in most of our states, non-citizens have been granted the right to vote, just like non-citizens.
If they owned property?
Well, no, not exclusively. Like, there was a period called declarant alien suffrage before the Civil War, where the rule in most of the Midwestern states, like Minnesota and the Western states, was if you declared that you were on the pathway to citizenship, they would allow you to vote, either in local elections or local, state, and federal, depending on the.
If these provisions that were passed by the local DC elected officials went into place, is it true that an illegal immigrant who's a felon could vote in DC?
This I don't know. You might be more versed in the legislation than me. I don't know. Most of the jurisdictions that have it, it's for non-citizens who are lawfully present. For example, in Maryland, a bunch of local jurisdictions in Montgomery County allow it because there are a lot of foreign diplomatic people and embassy personnel and people who work at the World Bank and the IMF, and they've always been allowed to vote in their local school board elections and stuff like that.
But it would allow illegal immigrants to vote in DC?
I just can't answer. I don't know. All non-citizens. So I assume if they were willing to dare to put their name on a public list like that, it sounds like under the DC proposal they could do it.
Do you have an estimate of how many illegal immigrants are in DC?
I do not know that.
Mr. Comer, Chairman Comer, do you have an estimate of the number of illegal immigrants in DC and who might be able to vote because of this?
The Washington Post thinks 50,000. That's what the Washington.
50,000, okay. And isn't it true that felons can vote under the DC rules that are?
I'm advised yes.
It seems to me like we could be in a situation, unless it's expressly prohibited, where illegal immigrants who are felons can actually vote in local elections. That seems pretty darn inclusive. Is that something you support, Ranking Member Raskin?
George Santos is in Congress, man, so it's a big country. And, put it this way, they cannot vote in D.C. in federal elections. So they would not be able to vote for Eleanor Holmes Norton or to run for the non-voting delegate position. It's only in local elections, as I understand it.
Chairman Comer, what's Mayor Bowser's position on the legislation that we're disputing here today with these two resolutions?
She vetoed the voting rights. She vetoed the criminal code. She vetoed the criminal code. She just didn't sign the voting rights. So she didn't support either bill. And the unions, police unions are supportive of both of our resolutions and opposed to DC's bill. So.
Why do you think the police unions, who presumably they vote in DC as well, and support home rule, why would they be opposed to this?
They don't believe that this legislation will do anything but increase the crime rate, which is increasing every day. They think it's too lenient. Too lenient. That's why the police union's opposed to it. And then, talking about the courts, the jury trials and stuff, Congress does have a constitutional role to oversee DC legislation. And we fund the judiciary in Washington, D.C. That's funded by Congress. So, we do have a say in this. And I think that if you listen and the Washington Post, the mayor, the law enforcement union, they're all opposed to what the D.C. Council has done and supportive of what these two resolutions are.
Mr. Raskin, you're not suggesting that what we're doing here by reviewing what the DC elected officials have chosen and passing a resolution to countermand it, to undo it, you're not suggesting what we're doing here is unconstitutional, are you?
No, I don't think it's unconstitutional. But that's why people want statehood. I mean, I think most people on the panel represent states that used to be jurisdictions that could get kicked around by Congress routinely on matters, and they don't even, get to speak for themselves. So I just think as a matter of basic democratic civic respect, we should allow them to have their laws. These are, some of these provisions in the criminal justice code provision, as I showed just looking at one, carjacking, are far more stringent than those in states that we represent. The non-citizen voting thing also, as I said, is existed
I
in a lot of places.
understand your preferences.
These are not my policy preferences, by the way. My only preference is for us to stay out of it and let them have.
I understand that's a preference of yours,
Yeah.
but Mr. Comer, Chairman Comer makes a great point that this is our constitutional authority and prerogative here to review what they've done. In fact, what we've done to let them go ahead and elect folks and vote on these things is more than the Constitution granted them. It's not prohibited in the Constitution to let them do this, but it's certainly reserved, and until the Constitution changes, and I know you would prefer statehood, but we don't have statehood. So in the absence of statehood, we have the Constitution as it stands, and this is our prerogative to vote on this. And I support these two measures, and I support the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, recognized for questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Chairman, I would seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the D.C. City Council, Chairman Phil Mendelson, expressing the council's opposition to these two disapproval resolutions.
Without objection.
My apologies, I was on the House floor presenting a couple of Native American tribal bills when the hearing started. But it's my understanding, is it correct, Chairman, that has there been any hearings within any congressional committee regarding these resolutions? Okay, so there hasn't been any hearings. And these, the laws that we are considering have been debated and considered by the city itself and by the council, and that council is elected by the residents of D.C. Is that correct?
That is correct, but as I stated earlier, Congress has a constitutional role to oversee D.C.'s legislation. So that's why we're here today.
So we've exercised that role in very limited instances, because one thing is when you have the ability, the other question is, should you? And I think that the issue of thinking about local control, I'm getting to know a little bit more about Kentucky. I'm becoming very fond of the Gattons, the Gatton family in Kentucky, and I would imagine that your cities in Kentucky, like my cities in New Mexico, need to address the issues at the local level, because they're going to know best, right? I would assume that Lexington would know best how to address issues regarding crime and policing and those aspects. The same way, Santa Fe or Chama or Tucumcari would know best about its local needs. Would you agree on that, of the importance of local control?
I would say yes.
Yeah. So, and I think that it comes back to the issue of I'm new on rules, and I go back to my, I fly back home 6-8 hours, so I can go back into my communities and they can tell me what's important. I did that this last 3 days, and issues about telling D.C. what they should be doing about their criminal code was nowhere on the to-do list that my constituents gave me. Right? They're very interested in what are we doing regarding healthcare? What are we going to be doing around the debt? Making sure we do not default on our debt. We do not do things that would hurt our veterans. I heard a lot from veterans this last visit, and those are the things that seem to be of urgent concern to my communities. Ranking Member Raskin, how do you see the role of these two resolutions in the bigger picture of should this be the kind of thing that Congress is looking at this moment?
Well, I think that's the central question, Congresswoman Fernandez. But like you and like Congressman McGovern, I've been out talking to constituents. Not a single person has raised anything that the D.C. City Council has done, much less these two specific resolutions, because they're much more concerned about what's going on in Maryland, and they're much more concerned about what's going on nationally. There's a lot of people happy about the fact that the unemployment rate is at a record 50-year low, that the economy seems to be booming again, that there are jobs available for people. People want to make sure that we're going to implement the Infrastructure Act that we passed and the Inflation Reduction Act. But nobody talked about this. What's interesting for those who are saying, well, we have the constitutional authority and permission to do this if we want, I think if that is people's posture, then we also have a constitutional responsibility to hear from the people of D.C. In other words, if we want to act like a state being super involved in a locality that we control and micromanaging it, we should have hearings that involve the mayor and the D.C. council and neighborhood leaders. We could go do it out in Washington, D.C. It's not that far away from here, I understand. And we could actually hear from people. If the logic is that Congress will be looking out for the best interests of people in Washington, D.C., we might be surprised by some of the things that we hear, because I can guarantee you they're going to be talking about statehood and about their lack of representation before they talk about any of the other stuff that's been raised today. But they don't like being kicked around like a political football.
And I would take it that if the voters of D.C. don't like what the city council did, they can vote them out of office next time around. They do have within the city level that democratic opportunity. Is that correct?
That is the democratic check. And, you know, the question my friend Mr. Massey asked me about, would this be unconstitutional? Maybe I said too quickly, no. I don't think it is, precisely because of Congress's plenary authority over the district. But there was a case called Clark versus United States where Congress overrode a vote of the D.C. City Council and ordered them to change the legislation. And that was found to be in violation of the First Amendment. So I haven't looked closely enough at all those cases. But in general, your point is right. If Congress wants to act as kind of the colonial overseer of the district, it can do that. But we've evolved many decades away from that. And that was the whole point of the Home Rule Charter.
So thank you, Chairman Comer, as well, for your sort of indication that, yes, it's always better. The local governments are going to know what's best, what's needed. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, is recognized for
Thank you, Mr.
question.
Chairman. Congressman Comer, on the voting, I just pulled this on the internet. I know there's some question about who could vote, felons, with or without an ID. If you're voting in person and you voted in D.C. before, you don't need to provide an ID to vote. Goes on to say if you're voting in person, you're a first-time voter, all you've got to do is provide proof of residence or a ID. Would that include a driver's license, you think?
That would.
Okay. Now, D.C. voters without any ID will be able to vote a provisional ballot and have 2 days following an election to show ID to the Board of Elections for their provisional ballot to count as a regular ballot. So anybody can vote. Anybody that you want. Mr. Raskin, do you know the budget of D.C., how much they spend every year?
If you forced me to guess, I could guess, but I do not know.
Just take a guess.
It's in the billions.
18 billion.
18 billion, 19 billion?
You know the debt of D.C. now?
No, I don't know the debt.
$4 billion. Now, we talk about the national debt and not defaulting. Is this going to help the debt situation and by the way, how much does the federal government already eat of D.C. state, of the D.C. proper?
Well, but I take it that that's a contested proposition. In other words, people argue on both sides because, of course, the federal government doesn't pay taxes, real estate and property taxes to D.C. for all the federal buildings.
How much does the federal government?
So
They take over a quarter of it.
I'm sorry?
They take over, the federal government at minimum is a quarter, is what our tax dollars pay to keep this afloat. Each year, and I think I'm right, when I first got into Congress in 17, they've forgiven debt incrementally each year, but it's $4 billion and rising. This would be a problem for our national debt.
Does that count towards the national debt?
If it's borrowed from the federal government, it does.
The DC, okay, I wasn't aware of that they.
So I guess the only other thing I would add is, you're talking about this not being proper to bring up. I think the American people are talking about crime. I think the American people are talking about this administration not doing anything to stop the border crossings. Do you know what New York City, and I think they've got 50,000 illegals. You know what they're over budget now because of the illegals? $1 billion. They're going to be asking the federal government for $1 billion. Would you think DC would do this? And I hear there's states that are fed up with what this administration is doing, and you're going to have busload after busload to come to DC, which is already short, I hear, of 300 to 400 police officers. But do you think that's going to add to the debt?
To the debt. Well, I mean, on your general point, I just agree with you. We're having a hearing about immigration in the Oversight Committee, and it's obviously a serious problem. And those, those people are being bussed into Washington, D.C. They're being bussed into Maryland. They're being bussed into
Oh, yeah, bust everywhere.
New York.
We're up to
they're
$5
being-
million, and
Yeah.
now, human support services make up close to 30% of the budget. So you're talking about a huge problem that taxpayers are having to burden themselves as it stands now. Thank y'all both for appearing. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy is recognized for questions.
I thank the chairman. Try to be brief. Mr. Comer, this is the United States Congress, right? The United States of America.
Yes, sir.
Is D.C. a state?
No, sir.
Under the Constitution of the United States, was D.C. contemplated to be the capital seat?
Yes, sir.
Is it the capital seat of the
Yes,
United
sir.
States? Do we therefore have a particularly unique interest as the Congress representing the people of the United States in ensuring that the capital of the United States is functioning properly and is being managed in ways that we think appropriate as Congress, both in terms of crime and in terms of those who are voting here in the capital seat of the United States?
Yes, sir. We have a constitutional role to do that.
What if people want D.C. to be a state, and my friend from Maryland and I have sparred over this and oversight and had some good conversations about it, maybe even a judiciary too, I can't remember. If some folks want it to be a state, that is a debate that has been ongoing, but it is nevertheless currently not a state. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So to my friend from Maryland, I would ask you a question that in '93, in the law review piece in which you advocated for non-citizens voting in local elections, you stated it would be difficult to allow non-citizens to vote in state elections because the U.S. Constitution categorically makes all persons enfranchised in state legislative elections into federal electors, and alien participation in national elections presents. I get kind of what you mean there, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, when I looked at the whole question and what Lincoln, how Lincoln got elected and how, it was controversial because people were saying that the immigrant vote counted, it just seemed to me that there are very, powerful countervailing considerations against allowing that to happen. But at the local level, if I've got a Canadian neighbor, presumably he and his family have the same interests in efficient garbage collection and good schools as everybody else does. So I think that has always been left up to local communities to decide who should vote in local elections. And the logic of that seems to me to be fine.
Would that be consistent with the logic that D.C. should be a city and not a state?
Well, I mean, that obviously presents a different question. And, what you posed to Chairman Comer, the words District of Columbia did not appear in the Constitution or Washington, D.C., nor was the geography of the capital city set in the Constitution. It just says in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, that Congress shall exercise exclusive legislation over the district that is to become the seat of government in land yielded by the states. And so it could have been Philadelphia, it could have been Annapolis, it could have been New York. Different parts of the country were vying for it, and there's, of course, nothing freezes it today. The question for us is whether, we think that simply living in the capital city and breathing the same air as members of Congress entitles you to disenfranchisement and not having representation in Congress. And I don't think any of us would consent to that proposition for people that we represent.
Well, again, without going through the D.C. statehood debate, I mean, those states are states in our union, right? And therefore have that enfranchisement that was considered in forming the union from
Well,
states
for
up through
13
the
of
union.
them.
But with respect to the district, the argument is that we have 435 of us here to decide what is in the best interest of the nation, including having a capital city seat of government. People can live here, and they could choose to live in that structure. I think the question before us right now is just, it's a pretty simple one, is whether the capital city, the national seat of government, should allow people who are non-citizens to vote. I think that's the question. And I think the question is a reasonable one that, to respond to the ranking member, I've had many constituents ask about it. I've had many constituents raise the issue and raise the question and concern about it. I've had many constituents and people who live in D.C. raise the issue about the safety and crime and issues of concern here in the District of Columbia. It's not a unimportant issue, I think, for the vast majority of Americans who want their capital city to be safe. They want their capital city to reflect their values as well, and believing that it's important for it to be citizens who vote, and particularly given the lack of exemptions for diplomats and other individuals that are here in the city. But I guess I would just, for time's sake, I'll probably just move on from that position, but I would just remind us that at the end of the day, we have a duty here. And the one last question I'd have for Mr. Comer is, do you believe that regardless of the outcome of this vote, that the appropriations process and the power of the purse is another important avenue to consider with respect to how taxpayer dollars are used with respect to the business carried out by the capital city of the United States of America?
Absolutely, 100%. Yes.
I yield back.
Gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Houchins, is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really glad that, at first I was a little bit unsure why we were considering both of these at the same time, but I'm really glad that we are because of some of the comments that I've heard in this debate. So first of all, a question for Mr. Raskin. How long have we been given this mechanism of home rule?
The DC Home Rule Charter was adopted in the modern period in 1973, when Congress extended it. It did exist in the 19th century and was revoked as black voting rights were taken away, and it was part of the anti-Reconstruction period.
So we have had this power since the 1970s, since 1970.
Before that, from the very beginning, Congress has had the power. Since the Organic Act was adopted in 1801, which is when Congress accepted the cession of lands from Maryland and Virginia and created a city. What was interesting is the lands were actually given in 1790, and people in D.C. continued to vote in Maryland or Virginia so they wouldn't be disenfranchised. And some people think of it as a kind of accidental disenfranchisement.
But we're not considering whether we're eliminating home rule today.
Well, it depends on who you ask, you know? I mean, the people in D.C.
No, we're not considering,
overturning
it is
the
not
charter.
overturning home
No.
rule. So what we are doing in these two resolutions is operating under a power that we've been given, that we already have. And it is up to us to determine the appropriate use of that.
Could I just make one point about that?
Just a moment.
Yep.
So do you know how many visitors visit Washington, D.C. from around the world, around the country?
I got to be forced to guess that one, too. I would say 200 million a year.
It's not that high.
It's not that high.
But it's 19.1 million visitors on average yearly. About 270,000 of those are from other countries. So the vast majority of people visiting Washington, D.C. are our constituents from around the country. So I want to pivot just a moment to the crime part of this, the crime resolution. That would be HJ Res 26. We've gotten two letters here, Mr. Raskin, from the National Fraternal Order of Police and a letter from the D.C. Police Union asking us to support the resolution of disapproval. Does that not impact you, in your opinion, at all?
Well, for me, that's easy, because for me, it's a question of a principle of political self-determination. I'm a lot more interested in what the police unions are saying about banning semi-automatic assault weapons nationally.
Okay, I'm going to reclaim my time.
Yeah.
Mr. Comer, I want to talk about the Voting Rights Act. This is where these two things, I think, uniquely intersect. So the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act makes no exception for foreign diplomats or agents voting in D.C. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would it be fair to assume that perhaps there are more foreign diplomats here in Washington, D.C. than any other major U.S. city, given the status of our nation's capital, the presence of foreign embassies, the State Department, et cetera?
Yes, definitely Washington and New York City, I would assume, would be the top two, by far.
Is it your understanding that our diplomats serving elsewhere abroad are given the opportunity to vote in local elections representing the United States?
I haven't seen where they are, but I could be wrong on that. I've never read that they were. I would assume no.
Can you think of a single positive reason why we would want individuals who have sworn allegiance to another country, in some cases hostile countries, like Iran, China, et cetera, to have a say in any elections, local or otherwise, in the United States of America?
No, in fact, this issue comes up a lot in Kentucky. People want us to stand up to our adversaries around the world, bring our jobs back, do something about foreign adversaries stealing our technology and intellectual property. And so this is a big issue. And let me say this, no state has allowed non-citizen voting since 1926. That was something I wanted to bring out as well.
So let me just put a pin in that for just a moment and turn to the crime issue. We've heard if the citizens of Washington, D.C. don't agree with the crime policy, they can just vote them out. Okay? Unless they're foreign agents who are utilizing this mechanism in the interest of creating chaos and disorder in our capital city. Is that not correct?
That's right.
Well, I'm very concerned, particularly on the crime side. This resolution eliminates the accomplice liability for felony murder. I just did a quick check of the Washington, D.C. Unsolved homicides from 2022. There were 122 that were unsolved. Do you think that eliminating the accomplice liability for felony murder makes those, solving those cases more or less likely?
Less likely.
And do you think that if we reduce some of these penalties, it overall makes the city of Washington, D.C. more safe or less safe?
Less safe.
And the Fraternal Order Police says that more than 500 officers have left the department. Does that make Washington, D.C. more safe or less safe for our constituents visiting?
Less safe. And I think in all of our districts where I've read just about, there's a shortage of police officers. And I think what their opinion with respect to criminal policy matters.
Yes. I just want to say that I think we need to give our law enforcement officers all the tools necessary to be successful. I agree with our law enforcement that we must not embolden criminals. We must not sideline justice for any sake. Public safety is a #1 priority, should be a #1 priority of our Congress. I appreciate you bringing this resolution. I want to yield some time to my colleague, Mr. Norman. Mr. Chairman, if I can. I'll yield to Mr. Roy, Mr. Chairman.
I would only add, there was a point earlier about the GDP of Washington, D.C. being bigger than, I believe, 17 states. I think is what the gentleman from Maryland said, or something along those lines. I would only note that an enormous percentage of the GDP of the city of Washington comes from federal government and government-related expenditures and issues related to the federal government almost directly, as opposed to significant industry and so forth. And then a good portion of the GDP related to any industry that's here are related to lobbyists. I yield back.
Thank you to the witnesses. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Langworthy, is recognized for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for coming in here today. These two topics that these resolutions relate to are very familiar to me as a New Yorker. We in New York have had to fight back very hard against a relaxation of criminal justice policies, the elimination of cash bail, and we've seen what the devastating impact that has had on New York City and all the residents of the state of New York. Also, I have led, as a statewide political leader, a lawsuit to stop the non-citizen voting that was put on the books by the New York City Council. under very similar arguments that the DC City Council is trying to put here. We have, I believe this great capital city belongs to all Americans, and this is the hallowed, halls of our government, the institutions, the buildings, the monuments. We are going to invite all of the youth of America will come here in the next several months as part of their education and rites of passage to travel to our nation's capital. And for us to be in a position where we're essentially not acting, I do believe there's been umbrage here by the ranking member that this isn't germane and this isn't what we were sent here to discuss. But taking care of this capital for all Americans is I think, a critical role of this Congress. And, some of the startling and alarming statistics that exist on the rise of crime, I just like to, we have reported cases of sexual abuse have risen 117% in the District of Columbia. And that is just a disgusting figure. As we are going to invite school groups and youth to the Capitol here, as they are part of our constituencies, how, I want to ask the ranking member, Raskin, how is reducing sentences on first-degree sexual assault and first-degree sexual abuse of a minor going to solve what is clearly a horrific problem of increased cases of abuse?
Okay, forgive me, because you might be more familiar with that provision. I did just look up the felony murder, where there was a new recommendation made. Some states, including Kentucky, don't even have felony murder as a statute, so I can look into that specific one. But I would suggest that the right analogy to think about, I was thinking about my friend Mr. Roy and what he was saying, is the capital cities of the states where we live in. The people who live in Austin, Texas are not disenfranchised, and the state government doesn't dictate to them everything that they do just because they happen to live in the jurisdiction where the Capitol building is. And I think that should be true of all 50 states. And if we want to liken ourselves to a state legislature over a city, we should show the people of that city the same respect that the state legislatures show the people who are in the cities and towns that we represent.
We are not discussing DC statehood here, and as we are all members of Congress, but as a father, it is mind-boggling to see that the District of Columbia, faced with skyrocketing numbers like that, rather than focus on their time and their energy on the victims of these cases, rather than work to make sure that staffing levels are where they should be, as Mayor Bowser herself points out, in order to ensure a speedy trial for some resolution for victims, but instead they are concerned about how to reduce sentences for people who commit some of these heinous, heinous crimes. And on to the voting rights matter. Just several questions for Ranking Member Raskin. Do you support allowing non-citizen staff at the Embassy of the People's Republic of China the right to vote in local D.C. elections?
I have absolutely no say in it. And if they ask me for my advice, I would say that people who represent foreign governments shouldn't be able to vote in local elections. It's obviously a minuscule number of people. I can't imagine that would affect a school board election there. But if, I would leave that up to the people of Washington, D.C. Remember, it's about local non-citizen voting. It's not about federal. They're not represented in Congress anyway, but even the non-voting delegate position would be immune to this. So I think we're in search of a horror story here.
But we do have a say in this. Do you support allowing non-citizen staff at the Embassy of the Russian Federation the right to vote in local D.C. elections?
I have opposed Vladimir Putin's massive social disinformation campaign against American democracy. I've opposed all contacts that the Trump administration had with the Putin administration, and I'm opposed to Russian subversion of democracy all over the world. So if they ask me my advice, I would say vote against that.
What, Ranking Member, what protections are in place to ensure that foreign nationals that are here that may be enfranchised for local elections, that those voting lists aren't commingled when it comes to, say, presidential elections?
That's a great question, and if we had a hearing, we might be able to find out by asking the head of the Board of Elections to come in and to see how they've separated them. But there are lots of jurisdictions in the country which do allow local non-citizen voting in school board elections and so on because they want people to be involved in their kids' education. So we could ask how they divide the voting lists.
Well, voting is a core tenet of what it means to be a citizen of this great country, and this so-called voting rights law actually dilutes the rights of the American citizens and devalues what citizenship actually means. This is a country, and this isn't about geographic expression. The bottom line is allowing non-citizens here legally or illegally to vote in our domestic elections is a violation of our sovereignty and the sovereign rights of Americans. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I thank both of you for appearing today. The witnesses are excused.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I would welcome our second panel, Representative Guthrie and Ranking Member Pallone.
Nice work, Chairman.
Mr. Guthrie, I'd welcome your testimony.